So the next session is going to have sort of a hybrid format. It's going to start with lightning talks, followed by a conversation. And I would like to introduce the moderator for this session, Margaret Chon, who is Donald and Linda Horowitz Endowed Chair for the Pursuit of Justice and formerly Associate Dean for Research at Seattle University School of Law. And she's also the faculty co-director of the Tech Innovation Law and Ethics program here at Seattle University. In addition to her many achievements in the field of law, she holds a master's degree in public health. And so please welcome to stage.
I'd like to invite my lightning round panelists to come up and join me, and we are going to engage in what I think will be a very stimulating sort of speed dating format for the exchange of intellectual ideas and understandings. So, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bachiner, for that lovely introduction, and I'm so privileged also to be part of this wonderful conference with such stimulating ideas so far already. And I think the next half an hour to 45 minutes will add to the feast, the intellectual feast. We're fortunate to have here with us today thought leaders in many different areas, but on this panel, 3 specific areas of biomedical health and health sciences, all of which are impacted by artificial intelligence, machine learning, and large language models, what we might call generally computational technologies. And those 3 areas include protein biology, healthcare ethics, and pediatric critical care. So I'm going to introduce briefly each of our 3 lightning round participants in the order in which they will give their 5-minute, brutally short presentations. The first is Ian Haydon. He's with the Institute of Protein Design at the University of Washington. Ian is trained as a scientist. He has a master's in biological physics and structure and design from the University of Washington, and he leads currently the strategic deployment, development, and execution of communication initiatives and execution of the Institute's pioneering work in protein design. And in addition to a lot of writing, he also films and produces educational videos. So that's our first speaker. He'll be followed by Alex John London, whom you've already heard from. And just to remind you, although Dr. Bachiner already introduced him, he is currently the K&L Gates Professor of Ethics and Computational Technologies and co-lead of the K&L Gates Initiative in Ethics and Computational Technologies. And I just want to mention that K&L Gates is a very large law firm here in Seattle, so I'm interested in seeing that connection. And last but not least, Dr. Mjaye, Mazwi, who is the division head of the Cardiac Critical Care Medicine at Seattle Children's Hospital here in Seattle, and co-executive director of the Seattle Children's Heart Center. He's a principal investigator at Seattle Children's in systems biology, professor at the University of Washington, and founding member of the Lawson Labs research group focused on translational modeling and data visualization utilizing high-frequency inpatient monitoring data. So with that, I'd like to ask Ian to come to the podium and give his 5-minute talk. And I think you'll get some warnings when you have 1 minute left from the table up here. Thank you.
5 minutes. We'll see. All right. I have some, there we go, perfect. All right, so in the next 5 minutes, I hope I can give you some insight into the specific area of science where AI has already had the biggest impact. Everything I'm gonna be talking about has been published in the last 4 years. It's been described as stunning by the UK National Academy of Science, the breakthrough of the year by the journal Science, and finally, an answer to the question of what AI is good for by the news site Vox. It combines chemistry and physics with biology and medicine and computer science, so it's okay if you're not super familiar with it. I happen to have a background in this area, and it's my job to explain it, so hopefully I can do some of that today. So what is the area of science where AI has already had the biggest impact? In a word, it's proteins. So this is a look inside is a scientifically informed and I think beautiful rendering of a look inside of one of your cells. If you could see down in there, you would mostly see proteins. Here they're colored all kinds of different colors. Your body makes about 20,000 different varieties, and they do the functions of life. Your proteins right now are digesting your breakfast, they're firing your neurons, they're powering your immune system. In other organisms, they turn sunlight into energy and carbon in the ocean into limestone. So proteins really run biology. Proteins are also medicines. They're used to treat over 100 diseases. Think insulin and antibodies. They're also the fastest growing category of medicine. And they're also vaccines. They can be direct immunogens. They can be part of a vaccine, or in the case of mRNA, they could be made by your body in response to vaccination. So they're important. So where does AI come in? We are all living through AI revolution in protein science. Let's jump to the next slide. Yeah. So it's pretty rare to solve a grand challenge in science, but something like that has happened very recently with AI. So the folks I work with at the University of Washington and many others have been building very powerful but very specialized AI tools that help us solve a particular problem. And that is, how is it the case in science that biological information, the stuff that is encoded in our DNA, how does that turn into biological function, at least at the smallest scale, meaning the molecular level, meaning proteins? We've worked on this for many decades, and in the last 4 years, we've made orders of magnitude improvement in our understanding of the system. There are pretty significant implications for what this is going to help us understand about diseases and also how we make new medicines going forward. So next slide. The particular area of interest that I want to focus on in our conversation today is actually running this process in reverse. This uses also new AI tools built in the last 4 years. And instead of asking a question about biology, like what does the human genome encode, how do those functions arise, it reverses it to say, if I wanted a new function, like an antibody that stops the flu, what biological information would I need to have to produce that function? How would I code for that antibody? And it turns out we can do that. So if we jump to the next slide. So this is exactly what my institute works on these days. Things like, it's not literally a text-based prompt, but it's something quite similar. Make me a new antibiotic. Make me a cheaper form of insulin. Things like that. So this is the area we specialize in. Again, these problems have been worked on for decades, but in the last 4 years, we've seen something like a 10 to 1,000-fold improvement in the reduction of costs, the acceleration of research timelines. These are really incredible technologies. I could literally go on all day about the benefits of this and why I think it's going to improve medicine. That's not really what we're here for. We're also looking at the challenges presented by these tools. I only have a couple minutes, so I won't give you all the answers, but I can talk about some of the ways we've been thinking about this. I'll focus on two. One point is that I firmly believe these technologies, which again are already published, they will impact medicine in a very profound way, but they alone will not change the medical landscape. And by that I mean fundamental questions like, is healthcare a human right? And if so, what does that mean? If these things are going to make drug and vaccine development faster and cheaper, who should benefit from that? I don't have answers, but I think that these tools place a renewed urgency on those types of questions. These are old questions, but we are being confronted by new technology at a pretty incredible rate. And then the last point that I'll close with, we've noticed as part of this tool building community that the power of these tools has surprised even us, and it's got us to think quite a bit in recent years about topics like safety, security, and openness. We're part of a public university. We are very proud that all of the tools that we've made completely free and completely open source, meaning any scientist can use them, download them, build upon them. Open science has been a big driver of this type of research. Not everyone building these tools does science that way. Some are private companies and it's not in their interest to do so. But how open should a technology like this be if it allows you to make a functional molecule? Isn't that itself potentially dangerous? We hope it is used for good, but who's to say it couldn't be used for harm? So we convened a summit in October. I'm running out of time, I'll just touch on it briefly, where we brought together many of the world's leading computational biologists who focus on this area of science, along with regulators, folks from the White House, many senior scientists from a lot of the big tech companies that are increasingly interested in this area, to focus on both what are the opportunities here and what are the threats? What's around the horizon? What should we be worried about? How do we conduct this science for the benefit of the world? We can get into it when I have more time, but there are practical solutions to a lot of the most concerning elements of this. Happy to talk about it. But there are also huge upsides of this technology that I wouldn't say allay the threats, but interact with those threats. One is that tools like this can be used to make vaccines for an outbreak regardless of its origin. So if someone designed a dangerous thing using AI, or it occurred naturally, or somewhere in between, our ability to respond to pandemic threats is accelerating as well. And technology like that can potentially save millions of lives and trillions of dollars. So it is really important to get this right. Thanks for the time.
Okay, thanks. So it's great to have a second bite at the apple, because I had to rush through a lot of my talk about the positive part, and so I planned in case the future me was like, if the talk me got too caught up. So again, I don't have a disclosure, anything to disclose, but I think working in this space is difficult because there's two kinds of misconceptions. Misconceptions about drug development, and then misconceptions about AI, and then they intersect. So this is the way a lot of people portray drug development, that there's a pipeline that's sort of linear. You go from lots and lots of candidates, and then it kind of narrows down into a few, as though it's just dropout, that you start with the same candidates you end with, and it's just that a few drop out along the way, or that most of them drop out along the way. But that's not actually true. It's not really a linear pipeline. It's much messier because you have these things. Every substance that we use as a drug is a toxin. At the wrong dose, it's going to kill you. And most things are going to kill you and not do anything good for you at any dose. So the struggle is to find things that have the potential to help you, but then what you have to do is develop the knowledge. What is the dose at which this will help you? What's the schedule at which this will help you? What are the contraindications? You can't give this to certain people, you can only give it to certain people. How do you find those people? What are the diagnostic methods you need in order to identify who's going to be a responder and who's not? All of these things are part of what Jonathan Kimmelman and I call the intervention ensemble. Drugs alone are not effective. Drugs with all of this ensemble of knowledge is what you need in order to have something that's either a poison or a treatment. And that's true for AI as well. So so the dimensions here in drug development are things like, what's the indication? What's the dose? What's the schedule? What are the co-interventions? Okay, so what we've tried to do on the positive side is then say, in AI, what we need is to think of the AI as part of an intervention ensemble. It is the part that gets the spotlight, but in and of itself, it's not going to achieve anything in the world. So it has to be implementable by people who have to know, what is the target? What is the function? What is the application for this system? Why is that supposed to be good? Like, what's the ultimate benefit? Not just in terms of like, it allows us to do this very little thing, right? It allows us to diagnose this condition. Very often diagnosis is one of the big things that people look for with AI. Diagnosis is often not the bottleneck. There are lots of things where it's like, yep, we can diagnose it, but we can't do anything about it. So having from the beginning a very clear sense of like, what's the ultimate value that you want? But then what are the conditions under which you can deploy this system? And what's the window within which it's going to likely to work well? And what's the window within which it's likely to degrade? Also, what's the population for whom it's indicated? What's the population for whom it's not indicated? So this is very similar in terms of it's the same notion of the intervention ensemble in terms of as we developed it in the drug context. But this is a general point about any tool that you're going to implement, right? And so then there also have to be the procedures that you need in order to say, once I have the tool, what do I need to do to be able to implement it and maintain it? So there need to be procedures now because you're going to have drift. And with some AI systems, as soon as you implement them, you're going to shift the distribution of what the patient population looks like and what the disease population looks like because you're implementing the tool in your system. So being able to identify what's our plan for dealing with measuring, tracking distribution shift, and dealing with it, all of those things are part of what you would need to have in order to have a functional intervention ensemble. That's why part of the message here is that it's not skepticism about the many scientific advances that are happening in protein folding and other places. Those are all wonderful and they're great. And in order to translate scientific advances into drugs, into interventions that are safe and effective, there are many, many more steps in between being able to do something at the protein level, at the cellular level, knowing that a certain receptor or a certain target, certain gene is responsible for the life cycle of a tumor, for example. That's key insight, but your ability to intervene on that in the world in a way that's going to produce a benefit for patients requires the development of this larger set of information. And so even if you have tools that narrowly can do exactly what you want, if you can't integrate them into a human system where people know when to use them, when not to use them, the populations that are going to benefit, the populations that are not, then the hard-won gains that it took at the bench to develop all that science isn't going to translate into a benefit. Where am I in terms of? Okay, thank you very much.
Good day. I represent an area of science where AI has yet to be shown to have benefit. And I want to explain, by making you aware of our context, why we are pursuing that question. I'm an intensive care doctor, and we are ever more reliant on technical systems to support our patients. This is a standard bed space now in my unit, and we have 24 of these. And what we ask clinicians to do in complex bed spaces like this is to integrate the data that's available to them to make some sort of reliable estimate of patient state. The reason that that's such an important exercise is it's only if you understand patient state that you can map that state to some category of risk. And it's risk that's action forcing in our environment. If my assessment is that the patient's state is well-compensated heart failure, then the most prudent action might be no action at all. If my assessment, however, is that the patient's in a state of imminent respiratory failure, then a series of actions need to happen, and they need to happen now. One of the real challenges in our environment is that virtually everybody in an ICU is an outlier. They are resistant to the sort of large, reliable, prospective, randomized controlled trials that produce reproducible knowledge in medicine. And so a lot of the decision-making in our environment is guided by our intuition. We naturalistically make decisions under conditions of very substantial uncertainty. So on this certainty-uncertainty spectrum, we are always closer to uncertainty and further from control. And that actually locates the potential use of analytics in an environment like this. This is another bed space. This is inadvertently HIPAA-compliant photograph. The 2-month-old that's in this bed space is hidden behind the gigantic renal replacement therapy device in the foreground. And you can see, if you just take a look at this picture, that they're both threats and opportunities here. The opportunity is that this is an unprecedented amount of data. A bed space like this generates something in the region of 350 million time value pairs per patient per day that we can use to refine our understanding of patients, disease mechanisms, and therapeutic efficacy. The threat, though, is that we know from cognitive neuroscience that the most remarkable minds in this room can probably only simultaneously process somewhere between 7 and 11 variables to support any given individual decision. And there are 76 simultaneous streams of patient-specific telemetry coming at a clinician from a bed space like this. And so what we do in these bed spaces is we prioritize information. We use our intuition to say, I think that data stream is going to be more important than that one in supporting the decision I have to make. And I think often we get it right, but sometimes we get it wrong. Ideally, the place for analytics in an environment like this is deployable models that help us reason on all of this data, not at any specific point in time, but at all points in time. And some of these models are relatively simple. This is an adaptation of Google's WaveNet model performing a heart rhythm classification task, something machine learning is remarkably good at, providing clinicians with certainty about what the heart rhythm is to support their decisions. Some of them are much more complex. This is a convolution and recurrent neural network that's being used to map directly from a vital sign data stream to a specific category of risk. So in other words, short-circuiting that clinician cognitive exercise that I was describing, with the goal being to provide clinicians with a patient trajectory through risk itself. The goal in deploying these models is that these models collaborate with human clinicians in a collaborative intelligence where the ultimate decisional authority still rests with the doctor. And this raises, as you can imagine, a host of ethical issues. We've heard about saturation probes, but I would argue that the opportunities with this kind of data outweigh some of the risks. You know, one of the reasons that we have chosen to focus on high-frequency data is that the patient behavior in an environment like the one I just showed you, the observed behavior is actually not just the patient behavior in isolation, it's the patient-device interaction as well. And we try to model the entire system. This is biometric data, it's continuous and pervasive, it's very dense, allowing us to make that dynamic state estimation continuously for patients. And I think it is less biased than other forms of electronic health data. If you're measuring a biological property of the patient, either on or from inside a body cavity, you're closer to the biological truth of that patient than the kind of representation of that patient that we get from the electronic health record. And this is a huge worry because, you know, as you've heard, because of the bias in historical medical data, if we use that historical data as training, we run the risk of hardwiring bias into our medical systems, making it even more pervasive and invisible than it is now. I want to end by saying something that I think is one of the most interesting aspects of doing research in this kind of area. The nature of innovation in medicine has always involved retrospective studies that make us much more certain about what happened in the past than what's happening now or what might happen in the future. And in a streaming paradigm, that is disrupted. You know, the idea is that we can reason in real time or near real time on patient data in ways that augment that clinician making that decision. That changes the paradigm, the research pact, if you will, that we have with patients from one where we ask them to participate in research with the goal of providing us with an insight that might apply to a patient like them at some point in the future. That's secondary gain, and we're relying on their altruism, to one where the pact is that we want to try to reason on your data in real time because that actually might benefit you now, here, and today. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank each of our three panelists here for giving such a great overview of their relative domains of expertise. And I just want to also say that in getting to know their areas of research and familiarizing myself with their work, it was such a pleasure for me, and I hope it is also for you, just to hear a little snippet of what they do. I'm reminded a little bit when I'm hearing these presentations of what Christopher Lasch said was one of the most defining characteristics of modernity, which is reflexivity of knowledge, that as we gain knowledge, we feed that back into what we knew before. And I think with what we're talking about here today across these three different areas, we're seeing this increased reflexivity within specific areas, but also across these fields, which I think is very, very compelling. So to just jump our roundtable off, you've given very compelling examples of how computational technologies can improve health outcomes and overall increase social welfare. But what are some examples, and you've given a few of these, but what are some of the critically important examples of conditions or assumptions that must be met before we can really harness that potential for good outcomes? And so starting with Alex, for example, you've cautioned that in the face of uncertainty, conflicting judgment, or novel circumstances, the duty to care can only be realized in practice if it is accompanied by a duty to learn. And you also mentioned that duty to learn this morning. And as a lawyer, I'm very interested in these ideas of rights and duties. And duties form the basis for tort law, that we have to establish a particular duty of care, standard of care, before we can assign liability. So can you elaborate a little bit about this duty to learn that you've mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, so part of it goes to just the pervasiveness of uncertainty. If you think about the way we understood cancer 20 years ago, the way we understand cancer now, you know, there's no analog to that in architecture. You know, it's not like people look at this building and go like, well, we don't think about this in terms of trusses anymore and load, you know, like that's yesterday, right? And that's because architecture stands on the background of 20,000 years of like trial and error. And we're still doing that in medicine and we're still learning. And I think it's really important that, you know, to have these examples like you presented where it's like real world, you know, real-time telemetry of the features of the patient that we care about versus these assumptions that you get when you're using proxies right? And then you're trying to build a model that says, well, from the proxies that I'm seeing, I'm trying to now hypothesize back in terms of like what the underlying causal structure is. And so I think in that sense, like being able to pick which data streams that we want to use and where we're much more likely to sort of get at the underlying, either monitor the underlying causal structure. I think that's where you need a much tighter intersection between the methodologists and the subject matter specialists, because I think not every data set is equally suited to support AI.
Great. Mjaye, would you like to elaborate on that a little bit? I know you've written and talked about the sort of incomplete and fragmented data landscape that you have to deal with, and you also mentioned that today. So how would you address that in response?
Yeah, I think when you said duties alone, one of the interesting barriers that we face in medicine is the absence of good benchmarks. I'll give you an example. So heart rhythm classification, that's a prototypical machine learning use case in medicine. This is something that industry is very interested in. Those of you that have an Apple Watch might be subject to a heart rhythm classifier right now, estimating your risk of atrial fibrillation. But there actually are not good benchmarks for how clinicians perform in that task. And that's a real barrier for us in applying these techniques in medicine. The concept being, what performance threshold do you need to exceed for this to be a reliable and safe tool? And I find this to be a really interesting and complicated question for multiple reasons. One is it limits our ability to know when any solution that we've developed potentially has benefit. The other is that the few benchmarks that exist are actually not that spectacular in terms of what they reflect on our aggregate performance as clinicians. Meaning, if you look at papers that purport to perform heart rhythm classification better than cardiologists or pathological diagnosis better than pathologists, they generally in papers like that have to identify what the aggregate clinician performance was, and it's sometimes distressingly variable. And I think that's an important observation, because I think of these techniques in medicine less as a new ceiling and more as a new floor. If we aren't likely to constrain people in making the extraordinary clinicians and making the extraordinary judgments that they're capable of. I think what we're hopefully going to be able to do with the first generation of these techniques that are deployed at a large scale is limit the variability at the lower end of the performance scale. So make care more consistently reliable across clinicians and across cohorts of patients.
Wonderful. Yes, Ian.
Jump in on that. I agree with everything that's been said, and I want to highlight from my weird little niche of protein science where AI has been transformative. It's not an accident. I think a lot of what you just said, there's a different story in protein science, meaning the data sets in that domain of science, the quality of those data sets is extraordinary. These are basically molecules, they're chemicals. So there is not patient data. There really isn't much subjectivity at all. These are empirical measurements of 180,000 proteins that thousands of scientists over the last 50 years have deposited into a central place, put it in the public domain, creating an extraordinary data set. And it happens to be the data set that deep learning is extremely good at learning from. So why do we see this technology in protein science in 2020? That's the reason.
So just to move on, though, to the ethical concerns that you stated at the very end of your 5-minute talk, I know that you were responsible in part for the drafting of this statement that was made subsequent to the conference that was convened here in Seattle on responsible AI in protein design. Can you elaborate on some of the parameters of what responsible AI development means?
Yeah, so this effort was born out of us and others, including folks in the government, noticing, hey, these tools are getting pretty good pretty quickly, and we ought to have some regulation in this space, basically. We ought to ensure that they're used for good and ensure that they're not used for harm. And they came to us and basically came to the scientific community and said, please help us. This stuff is very new, it's very complicated. We don't want to make policy or law in a vacuum. You let us know, what do you think responsible science would look like in this place? So really that was the focus of our October meeting with government in the room. And it was a wonderful conversation, months of follow-up work, and what we produced as one of the work products is a community statement. It's now been signed by 160 senior computational biologists who work in this space from all around the world, both academics and in the public sector, and we aligned on an articulation of values, like research should be done for the benefit of people, that science should be open to the degree that it's safe to do so, things like that. But also we enumerated 10 specific commitments, things that these researchers agree that their teams will do and will not do, applications they will not pursue, and standards around openness and model sharing and distribution that they must follow. This is a very first step. It's entirely voluntary. No one can make us do it. But I think it is wonderful to see the scientific community internationally both recognize the potential of these tools and the need to have these conversations, get alignment around them, and hold one another accountable. I do think that is at least a first step towards the development of this technology in a way that will benefit all.
Thank you. So this is obviously an interdisciplinary panel, and that's very important because, as Dr. Buckner mentioned in his introduction, we arguably need every single knowledge domain to come to bear on artificial intelligence in order to ensure ethical development and applications, especially in the healthcare realm. So, for example, Mjaye, you've stated in your TED Talk, which I very much highly recommend, that the research side of medicine needs to basically work more and handshake more with the clinical side in order to optimize data gathering for equitable and accurate machine learning. So for each of you, if you could send one message to your discipline from your discipline to the others, to the other disciplines represented here on this panel or in the room today to guide ethical AI, what would you choose to say and to whom? So I'll open this question up to any of you to start the discussion. Yeah.
I have a simple one, but it's one that we try to emphasize to a lot of audiences, and that is that there is not one solution to this. We represent a very distinct application of AI. We have weird, small models that are very powerful. And what you do with that, how you develop those safely, what ethical use looks like, there will be a distinct set of answers for those models in that domain. And the answers we come up with for large language model chatbots aren't really relevant. They're very different tools, and the differences in these technologies, I think, is really important. So I guess the advice is, or the recommendation is, it's not one size fits all.
That's great.
I would say we need a better pipeline. So in the sense that the applications for machine learning in medicine, we need a pipeline that does a better job of sort of saying what would be the priorities, that if we hit those priorities, we would really move the ball forward for the way our health systems function and what we can do for patients. And then we need degrees of maturity so that we can say, here, this was an early phase study, and then we need to find ways to avoid the reduplication of effort. During COVID, there were literally thousands of groups across the country that were trying to develop diagnostic technologies for, in radiographs to diagnose COVID from radiographs. A lot of it was, from the systematic reviews look at it and say it's been low quality, redundant. There hasn't been necessarily the kind of iterative improvements that you'd like to see in a healthy ecosystem. So, what we need on the computational side is a set of incentives where just publishing your paper and doing it at a conference, having to meet the 4 conferences a year, we need to find a set of incentives where people can invest over the long term in taking a technology, developing it to the point that it's mature, and bringing it from the bench to the bedside. And I think we don't have that ecosystem right now, and the incentives aren't there for this kind of long-term slog that it takes to sort of make something an actual, deployable technology.
Great.
Yeah, I agree with the comment about domain expertise, and also couldn't agree more with you, Alex. I think one of my pet peeves is we still exist in a paradigm in healthcare right now where what we consider research and what we consider clinical care are completely uncoupled from one another. And at my own institution here in Seattle, Seattle Children's is way up on Sandpoint Way. The Research Institute is downtown, They are administered differently. For those of us that have roles in both institutions, it's almost like belonging to two completely separate institutions. There are people at the Research Institute who probably will never go to the Children's Hospital. People at the Children's Hospital who will never go to the Research Institute. And I think that becomes a real objective translational barrier. That it doesn't just create additional impediments to this kind of slog that Alex is referring to. It also limits our ability to provide patients with benefit, and I increasingly see that as an ethical issue. There's a growing gap between our actual capabilities and what patients experience at the point of care as care.
So as a lawyer, I obviously believe in regulation, but this space it's pretty lightly regulated so far in the United States. I mean, we have now a proliferation of different task forces and executive statements from the federal government, but nothing really in the form of what I would call hard law. This is mostly soft law and voluntary initiatives. So in your ideal world, what would be one of the characteristics, one or two of the characteristics of an adequate and sort of responsive regulatory framework from what you're seeing, from where you're sitting right now?
To characterize your question a bit better, are you talking about specifically for sort of deployable solutions in
Yes.
healthcare? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from my standpoint, I see a lot of these tools, if we are going to responsibly deploy them, needing to pass through very well-defined stages. So, you develop your solution using historical data. There's a test training split. You think that you have a model that's well validated. I think that the next step that we should all be mandated in healthcare to undertake is well-designed silent trial, where the model is deployed in a prospective non-interventional framework. The goal is to run the model in the application domain in healthcare, whatever that application domain might be, against real data. Because there's always, if you've ever done this, there's always a degrading, basically, in model performance when you run it in real-world conditions. What that actually allows you to do is to begin to think in an objective way about what Alex was describing as this intervention ensemble. So, if you think that this is something that has benefit in whatever the application domain is, where does it have benefit? What is the breakdown in the current process that the model can target? And that helps you then design what that actual intervention ensemble would need to look like, that then should be subject to a true prospective interventional trial. And I think that that's actually one of the standards I'm hoping in healthcare that we can hold ourselves to that other fields haven't. As an example, I don't know how many of you have cars in the audience with self-driving features, and I would ask you to raise your hand if you know what the performance thresholds for the deployment of those self-driving features are. If they've been characterized, against which benchmarks. Does anyone know? Elon Musk's move. But that's precisely the problem. Yeah. And I think in healthcare we need to hold ourselves to a much, much higher standard than that.
Thank you.
So since we agree, and also just to hear you say that, it's like brings tears to my eyes. I mean, I'm on a group that's working on promoting silent trials, right, of these technologies, and I think that's exactly right. And I think what the problem is, people don't want to hear what you're saying because of the allure of cheap learning. The idea is that we can kind of bolt machine learning onto the healthcare system as it is, and we can take the data that we have and we can sort of spin it into gold. There may be places in sort of the back end and business part of medicine where we can do that. Mm-hmm. But in the patient-facing side of medicine, so let me do this in the other direction, right? Like it's amazing that the healthcare system is still held together by fax machines and by pictures of there are medical records where it's like it's digitized and it gets sent as a fax, and so like it goes out of digital format. Like we need to modernize the way we do medicine, and and I agree that we need to have more learning in medicine itself, right? So in that sense, I'm fully on board with that. And I think to really get on with the learning healthcare system, this sort of pipeline from you think you've got a good model, then you run it in silent You're going to learn a lot then, because I agree, like the data sets that we have, your performance is going to drop when you see in real data. And then from there, then validating it in, so being able to randomize more of our patients, because equipoise exists, the idea that you're not going to be worse off by being randomized to this new technology, that it's ethical to randomize patients in healthcare in order to get the actual data. Because once we randomize, very often that's when you see, oh, like, it was confounded. Like, like once you control for these confounders, you don't see your benefit. Being able to have a healthcare system that can support that kind of learning, I think to me, that's the move into the 21st century.
Thank you. Any thoughts? So I think we're running a little bit behind, but we have, how many more minutes? Maybe a couple more. I can't resist asking this question. So, and this is going to come from left field, I think, for all of you. As a Jesuit Catholic institution, Seattle University is committed to examining and taking action on what is called the preferential option for the poor. That is prioritizing the needs of marginalized and disadvantaged communities. So how does your work address or engage with this particular social justice principle? Ian, would you like to start?
I can
Sure.
weigh in. I think we're going to talk, we have been talking a lot about what these tools are and what do we do with them. I think it also matters a lot who builds these tools and why. And I say that again, I'll just echo, coming from one of the world's largest public universities that engages in a lot of this research, we operate as a public university, and that implies, that allows us to make decisions accordingly. Increasingly, we are competing for computational resources, research talent with very large tech companies who are also contributing incredible science and incredible technologies. I don't mean to disparage anybody here, but I think the reality is that different institutions that make technology like this have different incentives, rightly so, and each are good at certain things. And so it is not automatically the case that technologies like this will be built in every type of institution. It requires support, it requires durable support, and I just, it's self-interested, but I'll just echo, I think if we leave it only to the 5 biggest companies in the world, I think we can expect a lot more market-driven decisions, which will ultimately affect who directly benefits from these tools.
Yeah, thank you.
I think this is a great question. So my book is basically about trying to understand healthcare, not about interventions, but from the standpoint of creating systems that will meet the needs of the people in your population in an equitable way. And so it's very justice-based, and the needs of the people who are the most marginalized and poor and minoritized are the least well-represented, the least well-served by our health systems. Could AI play a role in closing that gap? Yes, I would like to see that. To the degree to which AI relies on historical data, then there's a fundamental challenge there because those people are missing in that data. And so in that sense, that's what I mean by, I don't think there's a short fix to this. And I don't think that we want there to be a short fix to this. We need to make our health system more inclusive and more representative and more available to every member of our population. And then that itself will create the basis for being able to use machine learning and all kinds of other AI techniques to advance the needs equitably of everybody in our population. But if you just go from like where we are now, you're going to continue to make treatments and interventions for the wealthiest and already most advantaged.
I actually don't have a whole lot to add to that extraordinarily eloquent answer. I think I've actually spent much of the last decade in the Canadian healthcare system, and looking at the differences in approach to things like access is quite a stunning thing to continue to be reminded of. We have an incredibly inequitable healthcare system, and unless everybody who is interested in unlocking insights understands that they have a role, an advocacy role, in addressing those inequities, we aren't going to be able to perform equitable science.
Thank you so much. If I don't say so myself, I think this has been a brilliant group of panelists, and I have lots of other questions I'd like to ask them, but I think we are now heading into lunch. But I do want to remind people that if you have questions, you can use the QR code on the tables, and those questions will be lined up for our Q&A this afternoon. But please join me in thanking all 3 of these wonderful speakers.
Thanks, everybody.
Really appreciate it.